as soon as you know you're being recorded, have you noticed that you start thinking about what you were saying? Yeah, so with this series of seminars, we're looking at different approaches to studies on the interface between Islam and Christianity. So we started last time with some biblical studies in Islamic context. And today we welcome Dr. David Cook, who's giving us a particular historical glimpse. So I think most of us know Dr. Cook already. He's a professor in the religion faculty here in Rice, and he teaches relating to Islam. He's one of the few people I meet who I had at least 3 of his books on my shelf before I'd ever met him. Some very useful books looking at jihad, looking at Islamic apocalyptic, and looking at more recent Islamic apocalyptic. I think David is really respected as a very thorough scholar, and also, I think, an honest and bold scholar working into some very difficult areas. So some of us have appreciated his project with a couple of his graduate students in translating some of the Boko Haram material, for example, as well as all the work on apocalyptic and history. So he's been working for several years on Ibn Asakir's history of Damascus, and we welcome you, David, to tell us what you've learned there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting me. This is definitely a pleasure. I don't get very many people who actually invite me to speak about Ibn Asakir nowadays. I'll just say in opening that last Christmas when I was with my family, no sooner did I walk in the door to my sister and brother-in-law's household that my sister trumpeted out, "Do not say the words Ibn Asakir in front of him." To which my nephew innocently said, "Who's Ibn Asakir, Uncle David?" So I was required by honesty to tell him the full story of who Ibn Asakir was, to my sister's great horror. Okay, so I will actually tell you a few things about Ibn Asakir. So let's start with some of the basic introduction here. So Ibn Asakir is the historian of Damascus who died in 1176. His life more or less spans the period of time known as the First Crusader Kingdom. And he spent his life essentially collecting materials that pertain to Damascus and then assembling them according to alphabetical order into this massive volume, which is known as the Tā'rīkh madīnat Dimashq, or what usually is called TMD. I'll probably periodically refer to it as that. So my task, I've read now TMD a couple of times. It's been printed in 80 volumes. And I decided a couple of years ago that, especially after reading a certain book by an Australian ambassador to Syria, who said very clearly there are simply no sources about Syria during a particular time, I decided, yes, actually there are sources. They're all in Ibn Asakir, which you don't use because it's way too big. But if we actually extracted the material and arranged it, then we could actually use it as a history book. So over the last 3.5 years, basically what I've been doing is taking the biographical entries and rearranging them into chronological order, translating all the different things that are of historical and religious and sociological interest, which is just about at an end. I believe that I can finish off with that translating text within a week. Oh. So, yeah, so there are 5,000. I've said it before, though. So a year ago, everybody heard me say, well, I'll be done by Christmas. That was not the case. But yeah, there's 5,996 biographical entries in the arrangement that I've done. So That's the source base upon which this is going to be taken. Now, so let's consider the issue of Christian and Muslim relations in Damascus. And here we have to say, honestly, that Ibn Asakir is not just the historian of Damascus, but the historian of Greater Syria as well. His materials basically cover pretty much all of the territory which today we would call the countries of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine, and gives us a huge amount of material, that some of which is hard historical, some of which is soft historical, some of which is entirely legendary, and a lot of which is literary in quality. So extracting from that is a mass, I cannot deny it. But we can start off, the project actually starts in 747, at the time when the Abbasids took over the area of Syria. I wanted to watch what happens to a province when it loses its power. Okay, we should remember that prior to that, between 661 and 747, that Syria was the center of the Arab world, okay, as the headquarters of the Umayyad dynasty, and that it lost that position and was never to regain it, or at least not during the period that was documented by TMD. And so when we start off, basically, Syria is probably an overwhelmingly Christian population with some Muslim populations inside the larger cities, especially, and then tribes that are gradually through the Abbasid period converting to Islam. By the time it reaches Ibn Asakir, around the time of the Crusades, probably Syria is more like about half Christian. But even today, as those of us who have traveled to Syria, Greater Syria and stuff know, that there's still substantial Christian populations inside the area. So we can ask, what are the documented sources that TMD allows us to see this process by which Islamization is happening, by which there's coexistence between the Christians and the Muslims? There's frequently learning between the two groups. Okay, as we start off, and here I'm just going to use a couple of different anecdotes for us. There's a great deal of material of an ascetic nature. Okay, so asceticism was extremely important. Here I'm very much forced to differentiate between Muslim asceticism, which is usually called zuhud, and its later development, which is Sufism, which we can call mysticism. Okay, so early asceticism really kind of involves denial, moving out from the world, and so forth, and was frequently associated, especially in Syria, with mountains. Okay, so especially Mount Lebanon, all the different coastal mountains and so forth. But we can also find it associated with the various different desert anchorites, of whom there were a considerable number in Syria at this particular time. So, not surprisingly, the first section of TMD chronologically really documents actually the good relations that are between Christians and Muslims. Okay, so the major figure at that particular time, this figure by the name of Al-Awza'i, okay, who died in 770, who actually ended up founding a not lasting Muslim legal right. About his funeral, it is said specifically that Jews, Christians, and Copts attended his funeral. He died in Beirut. Okay, very interesting. And we'll take a look later on at a particular figure who also entertained good relations with Christians and Jews. So, yeah, so we have on the part of very early figures, good relations in general. Okay, so much of that is characterized by conversations. We oftentimes find monks that are interrogated by various different Muslims. So tell us about your spirituality. How do you deal with grief? What does it mean to withdraw from the world? All sorts of different questions like that. It's really quite interesting to actually watch those figures converse back and forth. Now, that is the early period. there comes a particular time where we can kind of identify a sort of shift in the attitudes. Okay, so especially with the rise of Sufism, there's definitely more of a conversionary attitude, and what I've kind of come to call a a competitive style. Okay, so what we find instead of the Muslims asking the monks issues, we find people saying things like, "How long can you fast? If I can fast longer than you can become a Muslim. But if I can't, then yeah, actually they never say I'll become a Christian." I think that would be a little bit too much for Ibn Asakir to allow. Although I will say that there are actually 3 instances inside TMD of Muslims becoming Christians, which he does document. So, which is kind of rare inside the context of Muslim historiography. So, yeah, so we have that competitive aspect that starts to develop during the Middle Abbasid period, approximately later 800s, early 900s, and so forth. Okay, so let's just take a look. I hope I can. How do you scroll down here? Is this? Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not going to bother to read through this, but the figure which is identified here, the Sheikh Abu Bakr ad-Duki, okay, so who is actually, those of you who have been to Cairo, you might recognize his name. There's actually a quarter inside Cairo which is named after him. So he was well known as a prominent sheikh, and he's one of 8 figures who is listed inside TMD as being, quote, Sheikh of Syria. Okay, so there's only 8 people that actually get that title from Ibn Asakir. None of them are within 100 years of Ibn Asakir's actual lifetime. So actually, Aduki is number 6. So let's watch as we can take a look at what Duki. There's a number of different anecdotes about him and his relations with Christians, and many of them do turn on that issue of competitive sort of fasting, who can do the most miracles, and so forth. So you can see that the sheikh has followers. They are curious enough to go into a church, but they do not gain anything from the church, except for then we have a miracle in which the sheikh essentially gets the image to answer him. Okay, so very much paralleling certain things that you can find inside the Quran. Okay, so yeah, so then they all converge and so forth. Okay, so we have a lot of different conversion stories that are inside TMD. Okay, so many of those are focused upon monks. It's very common to find monks being the focus of Muslim conversion and so forth. Sometimes a given figure will run into a group of monks, and then years later, all of a sudden, he's circumambulating the Kaaba, and he runs into these monks again, except for now they're Muslims. And so, yeah, so there's a lot of different things along those lines. Okay, so the first first broad section of Ibn Asakir's work, TMD, is characterized by a lot of different miraculous stories. Okay, so that essentially changes, and we're going to focus the balance of the lecture on the second half of Ibn Asakir. Okay, so Ibn Asakir is when you divide it up chronologically, it's very easily dividable into what we can call pre-Karmatian period and post-Karmatian period. Okay, so the Karmatians are a group of Ismailis, okay, 7 are Shiites, who did not see themselves under the authority of the Fatimid caliphs, but essentially channeled the desires of the Bedouin population to attack the settled areas, especially of Syria, but also of Iraq, among their other different things. They pillaged the Kaaba and actually looted the Black Stone. So the Karmatians were pretty much hated by everybody. And among other things, they attacked Damascus repeatedly and took it over several times. Okay, so there's a certain period chronological period between let me see whether I can think in Christian date terms. It'd be between I'm sorry, 363 thereabouts, 364. I'm sorry, 964. Sorry, I'm being confused by my Hijri dates there. 964 and about 980. Okay, so that period was one of about 13, 14 years, which Damascus actually went through 28 documented rulers. Okay, so yeah, so we can just see by the number right there how turbulent that was. I've come to call it, it's my chapter number 6, actually, in the chronological reworking of Ibn Asakir, and I've come to call it the Karmatian interlude. Okay, no major Damascene family can be documented that actually went all the way through it over to the other side. So it's a complete tabula rasa. Okay, we can't know whether all those people were murdered or not, but the fact is that, yeah, all the prominent families that can be documented beforehand don't persist afterwards, and all the ones that are documentable afterwards, you can't find any ancestors of them beforehand, or very few. So it's obviously a very turbulent period for Damascus. So it marks the halfway point in the presentation of TMD, and it also marks kind of another interesting point at which, beyond which we don't find very many miracles. Okay, so I've come to call it the end of the miraculous. It's very interesting because I think that this is the particular point where Ibn Asakir began to see, because his own family pretty much dates from that particular time, that he began to see kind of like his intellectual ancestors at that particular time, and simply ceased to document miraculous stories. So yeah, so what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at the period afterwards. Now that period does not have very many mentions of Christians. Okay, so yeah, basically the pre-Karmatian period, we have Christians in monasteries, we have Christian poets, a lot of them. Okay, we have Christians that are converting, and we have a lot of people who will say that they are of Christian ancestry. In other words, they say, well, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, whatever, converted from Christianity. So it's very obvious that we do have movement from Christianity into Islam at this particular time. So the first figure that we'd like to look at, who is an absolutely major figure. Okay, so within the context of TMD, I can't stress the importance of this figure. So his name is Abdurrahman. He's best known as Abu Muhammad ibn Nasr. Okay, so you can see, according to this particular anecdote, there's some textual problems, but his name is known from many other different sources. Okay, so you can see he was actually the Sheikh of Damascus. He's the last one that's attested. And basically, pretty much all of the major tradition relators who Ibn Asakir saw as his intellectual ancestors more or less come from this figure here. Okay, so he's very definitely well worth studying. So his father was known as the emir of the raiders. Okay, so he apparently had a function within the process of protecting Syria. Okay, we should remember that during the 360s, 370s, okay, which would be the 970s, 980s, and so forth, the Byzantine Empire had managed to take over or reconquer, depending on how you want to look at it, much of northern Syria. Okay, my own private theory about Ibn Asakir is that his ancestors are actually refugees from that takeover. Okay, and one of the signs that we can see from those people who were refugees is that they lack Arabic nisbas. They lack any particular tribal affiliation. Okay, and that's also true of Abu Muhammad. He's a very august figure, as we can see from this particular anecdote, extremely wealthy, and his house is actually identified. Okay, so his house sat on the particular boundary between the Muslim quarter, one of the Muslim quarters, and the Jewish quarter. Okay, so the Jewish quarter, however, in the southwest or the south, I'm sorry, the southeast of Damascus, is one of the least desirable places to live. But Abu Muhammad actually sat, kind of like much in a pretty good neighborhood. He was a wealthy guy, and we continually read about how he brought people into his house, especially the tradition relators, and educated essentially a whole generation. Okay, so we should remember that the Sunnis of Damascus at this particular time are under tremendous pressure. Tremendous pressure, because this is the middle of that period known to historians as the Shiite century. The Shiite century is one where all of a sudden, through many different forces, which you can't go into right now, the entire Muslim world became ruled by Shiites. Okay, this is a huge shock for Sunnis, who were very used to actually being in the majority, and they probably still were in a place like Damascus, okay, which was never a Shiite city. But nonetheless, they were locked out of virtually all of the what we can call like upper level positions. They couldn't be judges, they couldn't be imams, they couldn't be preachers. Okay, and the Fatimids and those people that were associated with them pretty much dominated in the intellectual scene. Okay, so the Sunnis at this particular time had to build what we can call like a counter society. And so it's very interesting that Abu Muhammad was really sitting at the center of that. Okay, now notice what it says. A large number of the traditionists preceded the procession saying, La ilaha illallah. Okay, and then Allahu Akbar, etc., manifesting the Sunnah. Okay, many of the city's inhabitants attended his funeral, even a number of the Jews and Christians. Okay, so it's a tidbit, but we can see that the Sunnis at this, what we can call like the low point of Sunnism inside Damascus, actually maintained really good relations with Jews and Christians. Very interesting. Now, as we're looking through TMD, as I said, one of the things that what we can call like an Ibn Asakir exception. Okay, an Ibn Asakir exception has to do with the question of especially poetry. Okay, so Ibn Asakir had very, very strong convictions. And he regularly says, like this guy, he dealt in this particular thing and he needed to repent. Okay, there are a whole long, I've assembled a long list of all the different funerals that he attended. Not a single one of them was of a literary figure. Every single one of them that he admits to is actually a traditionalist. But he still loved poetry. And so one of the things that we can see is this tension within Ibn Asakir. What can he include? And what doesn't he include? Okay, so there's a particular guy in there. He goes, I saw this guy drunk. And he says, I'm not going to cite his poetry. But you could ask yourself, seriously, Ibn Asakir? So am I supposed to assume that all of the other ones in here weren't ever drunk? Really? I don't really think so. I think that there's other different criteria involved as well. But, of course, it's hard to pin Ibn Asakir down, isn't it? Yeah. So Ibn Asakir does include a lot of Christian poetry. Okay, so he includes a ton of poetry, especially about monasteries. Okay, so we should always understand monasteries were a big thing for Muslims. This is a place where they could go and kind of hang loose. Okay, so Ibn Asakir contains a ton of material, especially from a very important book, which has been partially reconstructed. But unfortunately, the section on Syria has not survived, only the sections that Ibn Asakir actually cites. It's called the Book of Monasteries. And the Book of Monasteries contains, in its reconstructed form, it contains a huge number of monasteries that are in Iraq and Iran. It doesn't contain any monasteries in Syria. But Ibn Asakir, fortunately, actually does cite it for a number of different monasteries that are in Syria. So we can, I wish I could have written to the editor and said, yeah, you please look here. You can add in like a couple more monasteries here. Okay, so the monastery issue is kind of one of those Ibn Asakir exceptions thing. Okay, because you can imagine what's going on in monasteries. What do you think the first thing that happens in there is? First thing that happens is somebody notices that there's beautiful grapes. And then pretty soon the priest or monk or whoever brings some wine. And wow. Okay, so then after that, it's all downhill from Ibn Asakir's point of view. Yeah, so we have a lot of different descriptions of monasteries. Okay, and although it isn't mentioned inside Ibn Asakir's TMD itself, but we do have one precious mention from his close friend. So I'll just mention his name, okay, because I actually listed it under point number 4. Okay, so the figure of Sam'ani, okay, Abdul Karim Sam'ani, okay, who is well known as a historian, as a traveler. Okay, so him and Ibn Asakir came together in what I have come to call an intellectual explosion. We don't know precisely when it was, because neither one of them actually described their initial meeting. They're definitely met up on their travels, probably in the East. Okay, so Sam'ani, who's the author of various different works called Kitab al-Ansab, the Book of Genealogies, and an unfortunately lost postscript to the history of Baghdad, a number of different other very important works. He left us a precious picture of Ibn Asakir and him lounging next to a monastery just outside of Damascus, reciting poetry to each other. Yeah, that's the way that we want to see that Ibn Asakir. Yeah. So Ibn Asakir does definitely have that other side to him. Okay, I strongly suspect that many of the poetic citations that he gives were actually given inside the context of drinking sessions. Okay, I don't personally believe that Ibn Asakir himself actually participated in the drinking. Okay, because I think that his moral strictures were too strong to be able to do that. But yeah, I think he's got some other different sides to him that come out in those sort of things. Okay, so let's just take a look at one poem. I've translated hundreds of his poems, so I decided, I would just give you like a small poem here. Okay, so we have a lot of different poems that are going to be associated with the Crusades. Okay, so the some of the poetry that I am going to introduce and talk to you about is especially associated with the northern Syrian town of Ma'arat al-Nu'man. Okay, so very interesting. Ibn Asakir knew a lot of refugees from that area. Okay, so it was destroyed by the Crusaders when they went through, in 1098. Okay, so as a territory, it was very closely associated with the Arab tribe of Tanukh. Okay, we should always remember about Tanukh that when the third Abbasid Caliph saw them, they came out and greeted him wearing a whole bunch of crosses. That set off the Caliph al-Mahdi, and he flew into a rage and demanded that they all convert to Islam. So I might add that Ibn Asakir cites a lot of different things about al-Mahdi, but he doesn't cite that particular anecdote. I think it was too painful for him to remember and to note that the tribe of Tā'rīkh actually hadn't converted to Islam immediately. It had actually taken 130 some years before they were converted. Okay, so many of Ibn Asakir's closest friends were from Tā'rīkh, and I think that he just didn't want to regurgitate that particular anecdote. So here we can see a short poem. I included it because I want you to see some of the poems that were for the time of the Crusaders. Okay, so we have this particular figure who goes back to Marat Nu'man after it had been destroyed. Okay, so he says, "O crier over this town, God has foreordained this very ruin that you see. So stop the reddish camel, go once, and weep over those elders and youths who are here, and take heed upon our entering this town that once upon a time these were loved ones' residences." Okay, so this is very much in line with classical Islamic poetry, which oftentimes talks about the ruins, okay, that call forth the memories of the beloved and so forth. Okay, so yeah, so we actually can see that very issue here. Ibn Asakir's attitude towards the Crusades is an interesting one. Okay, so he actually is born just a couple of years after the Crusaders appear, and he dies just a couple of years before the Battle of the Horns of Hattin in 1187, which is the decisive battle that brings to an end the first Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. So his entire life, he lived with the presence of the Crusaders. Okay, so the Crusaders were not some group that was just out there for people in Damascus. In other words, the Crusaders could actually, the Franks, could actually invade Damascus at any particular time, and often did. Okay, so there's a close town to Damascus. Today it's actually part of greater Damascus called Daraya. It's kind of interesting that 2 years after Ibn Asakir dies, the Franks actually they pull off a daring raid, and they actually steal the gates to the city. What were they thinking? Gates? Really? Yeah, so that shows you how how close Damascus was to the Crusader frontier. Ibn Asakir had a problem with Damascus and the Crusaders. And I wish I could quantify this problem absolutely, because he never states it completely. But especially during his formative years, okay, up until his middle years, he absolutely refuses to chronicle anybody who had close personal relations with the Latin kingdom. Okay, now that presents a major, major issue for us. Okay, because a lot of those people were people that actually were very important inside the context of Damascus. And they're very interesting for us because these people who we have to kind of like reconstruct from a number of different other later sources oftentimes traveled back and forth between the Latin kingdom and Damascus. Okay, in spite of Ibn Asakir's attitude, we should always remember that Damascus actually was in alliance with the Crusaders for most of that time. Okay, so and one of those people was his friend Sam'ani. Now, when I first started to suspect that, actually a year ago, it was only through inferences. But then finally, I found actually a whole series of notes associated with Sam'ani, and actually, I've now published an article on his trip to the Latin Kingdom. Okay, now the interesting thing about the trip to the Latin Kingdom, which took place in the summer of 1141, okay, which is when Sam'ani paid a visit to Ibn Asakir. Okay, so Ibn Asakir at that particular time had just come back from his second trip. He was at the top of his profession. He was just starting to conceptualize at that particular moment what TMD would really look like. And he was beginning to shape the materials that had been given to him by his many teachers and so forth and put them into form. It was during that time that he conducted many of his most interesting interviews too. Okay, because he tracked down people that were close to death and so forth, and he shook them down for information as best he could. So Samani had been a footloose guy. He had been traveling from his native town of Merv, okay, today in Turkmenistan, for about 10 years, okay, ever since his father had died. Okay, it's kind of curious that Ibn Asakir also left Damascus just after his father died. So it's kind of interesting to watch the different things that pulled these two together. They knew a lot of the self-same people. And when we backtrack through TMD, we can see that their families actually had some interesting connections from previous generations. But Samani so then appears in Syria during the summer of 1141, travels down from Aleppo, avoiding Frankish raids at every particular point, which he comments, and then finally arriving in Damascus in June. And then he begins to meet a whole slew of people that Ibn Asakir doesn't want him to meet. Okay, these are the guys that are traveling back and forth. Now, we could wish we knew more about them. Okay, because one of the things that has kind of become a research objective of mine is what happens to the Muslim community under Frankish rule. Okay, because we know from travelers like Ibn Jubayr, okay, who travels just before the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, there's a lot of Muslims, and they're actually pretty loyal too. Ibn Jubayr is very distressed as he goes through towards Tyre and Acre. Okay, because one after another, he discovers Muslims that are saying, "Yeah, it's pretty good to live under those Franks," and he does not like that at all. So, one of the things that I would love to be able to find out, and which Samani could have told us, but of course, it's hard to extract it from him, is what exactly was the Muslim educational system like under the Franks? What was the leadership there? Because most of the leadership fled. Okay, it's a situation that very strongly reminds us of the partition between India and Pakistan. Okay, where most of the higher Muslim leadership goes to Pakistan, but we know, and all of us know, hopefully from visiting India and so forth, there's a lot of Muslims there, but they, in general, were stripped of their leadership basically in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s by people going to Pakistan. And that's the self-same process that we can see with regard to Ibn Asakir's portrayal of the relations. He gets all of those guys who are fleeing from, let's say, like Jerusalem or Tyre or Nablus. Okay, so they all go to Damascus. Some of them keep on going. But what was that of those who stayed? Were there imams? We know there were mosques. Samani goes to Acre. Okay, he goes to Acre. Guess where he goes? He goes to the cathedral. And what does he notice? He notices that the Franks have left, because formerly it was a mosque, they've left a section of it as a mosque, and that's where he stays. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. He goes to Caesarea. He finds a guy there who says there's only one family there. So we worshiped together. He did a Jummah prayers there in Caesarea under the Crusaders. I wish that he had left a fuller description of his time in Jerusalem. But let's go back to the marginal figure who sets it all off. This particular figure, I have to extrapolate here. Abdurrahman bin Abdullah bin Abdurrahman al-Halabi al-Khalkhuli. Okay, so because he doesn't appear in TMD. Very interesting. The term Khalkhuli there, okay, refers to a Palestinian town which is still extant. It's just a little bit outside of Hebron. And what we learn from this guy is that he went back and forth to the Crusader kingdom and had actually constructed a shrine there, a shrine in memoriam of the prophet Jonah. Okay, now we have to backtrack just a tad here because Prophet Jonah, somebody that we can say is pretty much pan monotheist. Okay, he's venerated Jewish, Christian, Muslim. And that's exactly what we find when we take a look at those people who could actually record anything whatsoever about his shrine. Is that it says specifically that knights would come there and worship when Khalkhuli was there. He's just the sort of guy that Ibn Asakir doesn't like. So Ibn Asakir actually does go and visit him periodically. That's the reason why we know that excluding him from TMD must have been an intentional thing, because later historian actually says that Ibn Asakir did visit him occasionally and knew who he was, and may very well have introduced Zam'ani to him, because Zam'ani would have never gone to Khalkhul if he hadn't known about it. Khalkhul is hardly on the major list of tourist locations for a Muslim. There's no way that he could have known that that shrine had just been built. Okay, so very, very interesting. My conclusion with regard to that, and there's a whole series, we don't have time to talk about the others, but it's a whole series of figures that are associated with Sam'ani's visit to the Latin kingdom in the summer of 1141 that somehow or another just don't appear inside TMD. I think that must have been intentional. I think that was basically Ibn Asakir saying, I don't want to have anything to do with somebody who's going. But here we have another Ibn Asakir exception, because Sam'ani was just too much to give up. You love Sam'ani. Okay. And honestly, when you read his biographical entry for Sam'ani, which was written in 2 different times, I think that it's really the warmest and most beautiful biographical entry of all of Ibn Asakir's contemporaries. He says, may God bless him. He's a great guy. And he lists off all the different countries and cities that Sam'ani has been to. Which fills, like half a page. Except for he doesn't include any of them from the Latin kingdom. So let's take a look at our entry right here and see what we can learn from it. It's very interesting. So this is taking place at kind of a hinge moment. The hinge moment from the Western point of view is called the Second Crusade. So the Second Crusade was engendered because the Latin county of Edessa had been conquered by the Turkish warlord Zengi in 1144. So that had necessitated people like St. Bernard of Clairvaux in preaching the Second Crusade, for which, I might add, St. Bernard was to pay dearly. The Second Crusade proceeded to the area of Syria, and against all odds, the Second Crusade decided to attack Damascus, which otherwise is kind of a difficult decision to understand, since Damascus was really the Crusaders' only Muslim friend. So this happens, as you can easily see, just 7 years after Sam'ani visits. Okay, we only know about this account from Sam'ani's Mu'jam. Okay, so his collection of authorities. Okay, so he lists this particular figure. So he says the end of his life was the Franks camped against the gate of Damascus during 1148. That's the Second Crusade, and besieged it. Okay, it happened that the Franks overpowered the Damascus gates on that day, and the people retreated. Now, here we have a very, very interesting question, which cannot be resolved on the basis of the material that we have, which is that there's substantial numbers of Christians inside Damascus. There's many churches, which are actually documented by Ibn Asakir. What happened to those Christians? Whose side did they fight on? Whose side were they supporting? That's not an easy question to answer, because we should always remember that the Franks oftentimes massacred local Christians. Okay, sometimes not even realizing that they were Christians. And the Muslims, of course, had every reason to believe that the Christians were fifth columnists. So one of the interesting and unexplained things about the Second Crusade is that this attack that he's describing here was the first attack on it. Okay, the overrunning of the gates actually happened in that section of Damascus that faces where the Muslims live. Okay, so after they're beaten back, okay, which he describes as a number of the righteous and learned fought and prevented the Franks from entering the town, the likes of Abdurrahman al-Khawkhuli and the Maliki Imam al-Findalawi, who was one of Ibn Asakir's close friends, as well as others, were killed. Okay, so this is a story that's repeated everywhere. Okay, almost all of the historians talk about it. Probably the best known figure from this particular time, Osama bin Munqidh, describes it actually in his memoirs and so forth. So it has a lot of different variants. But then the Crusaders actually do something weird. They go around to the other side of Damascus and attack via the east, which is the Christian side of the city. Nobody can really explain that. And I can't either. So honestly, I can't. I honestly, and people who studied the Second Crusade can't understand it. Why did they switch sides when they almost overwhelmed us? So either they believed that the Christians inside would help them, or perhaps they were the victims of bad intelligence in some way or another. It's really kind of hard to say. But yeah, so here we have a martyrdom. Okay, so this is a martyrdom that Ibn Asakir does his best to actually push. But the only martyr that he lists is Findalawi. He doesn't mention Abdurrahman al-Khawkhuli at all. Okay, so it's kind of ironic that for the Second Crusade, the best known martyr for the Muslim side is this figure of Findalawi, who actually came from Morocco and wasn't really Damascene at all. And yeah, and somebody like Khawkhuli, who is actually Syrian, is neglected completely. So yeah, I'm going to sum up here and say no Christians are mentioned explicitly with biographical entries in TMD after the year 450, okay, which is about 1060. So in other words, the last 140 years of TMD documentation, there's no Christians that are actually listed as biographical entries. There are quite a number of mentions of Christians, allusions to Christians, especially Franks, okay, and usually medical doctors, okay, of which there's quite a number. But nonetheless, I strongly suspect that actually Ibn Asakir had a lot more connections with Christians than he let on. And I think that that's probably likely to have happened in those poetic sessions. So, but since there's no way to prove it, I can just leave you guys with that and say Ibn Asakir, a fascinating guy who has a lot of different hidden corners to his work. And I hope you'll be able to read it through my translation soon. So, anyway, thank you.